Mercedes were supposed to be exposed. The FIA had already stepped in. The hot engine loophole was supposed to be closed. The dangerous hybrid trick was supposed to be banned. The front wing questions were supposed to be behind them. Then Antonelli took Monaco pole by 43 thousandths of a second. And that tiny margin may have triggered the biggest revolt of the season. Because rival teams are not just asking how Mercedes went fastest. They are asking how Mercedes stayed this fast after every obvious advantage was supposed to be gone. A reported 0.3 per lap engine gain. A new hot test at 130 degrees Celsius. A front wing investigation. A hybrid shutdown exploit that raised safety concerns. And still, Mercedes dominated the most unforgiving qualifying session in Formula 1. So now the paddock has one terrifying question. Did the FIA close the Mercedes loopholes, or did it only close the ones everyone could see? Because if Antonelli's Monaco pole proves one thing, it is this. Mercedes may not have one trick. They may have built an entire car out of them. Subscribe to the channel. To understand why rival teams reacted so strongly after Monaco, you have to understand what they thought they were about to see. They thought Mercedes were finally going to look normal. Not slow. Not lost. But normal. Because before Monaco, the FIA had already started closing the doors around the Mercedes controversy. The hot engine loophole had been targeted. The emergency hybrid trick had been restricted. The front wing issue had already been investigated. The sport had begun responding to the exact questions rivals had been asking for weeks. So Monaco was supposed to be the answer. If Mercedes had been dominating because of gray areas, then once those gray areas were closed, the car should have lost something. A little speed. A little confidence. A little control. A little of that strange, untouchable feeling that had made the W17 so uncomfortable for the rest of the grid. That is why teams were watching so closely. They were not only watching Antonelli. They were watching the car beneath him. Every acceleration zone. Every braking phase. Every rotation through the tight corners. Every moment where the Mercedes seemed calm while others looked nervous. Because Formula 1 teams do not believe in miracles. They believe in causes. If a car is faster, something is making it faster. If a driver looks calm at Monaco, something is giving him trust. If a team stays at the front after the FIA has already acted, then rivals do not stop asking questions. They ask sharper ones. And Antonelli gave them the worst possible answer. Pole position. By 43 thousandths of a second. That number matters because it is almost nothing, and in Formula 1, almost nothing can mean everything. 43 thousandths is one tiny throttle movement. One slightly cleaner exit. One breath less hesitation. 1 inch closer to the wall. One invisible advantage that only appears when the stopwatch exposes it. So when Mercedes took pole by that margin, rival teams did not see closure. They saw a reason to dig deeper. Because this was not a normal Mercedes result. It came after months of suspicion, after multiple technical questions, after the FIA had already begun tightening control around systems linked to Mercedes speed. That is how a revolt starts in Formula 1. Not with teams shouting in public. With engineers asking where the time came from. With rival technical departments comparing traces. With team principals pressuring the FIA to make the rules clearer. With every manufacturer asking whether the championship is being shaped by performance that should have been caught earlier. The first and biggest question was the engine. Under the new power unit rules, Formula 1 had entered a different kind of era. The balance between combustion power and electrical energy had changed dramatically. The car was not just about raw engine strength anymore. It was about managing heat, electrical deployment, efficiency, and timing with extreme precision. And Mercedes appeared to understand that world first. Antonelli was leading the Drivers' Championship. Russell was second. Mercedes were leading the Constructors' Championship. Their pace was not isolated. It was not one lucky weekend. It looked repeatable. And repeatable speed is what scares rivals most. Because repeatable speed means the advantage is built in. The controversy centered on something called compression ratio. The simple version is this. Inside an engine, air and fuel are squeezed before they burn. The tighter that mixture is squeezed, the more powerful the release can be. It is like pressing down on a spring. A gentle push gives a weak snap. A harder push gives a stronger one. That squeeze is power. So the rules limited it. 16-1. That was the maximum. But the problem was never only the number. The problem was the test. According to the source material, the compression ratio was originally checked when the engine was cold, sitting in the pit lane, at ambient temperature. That sounds fair, until you remember that a Formula 1 engine does not race cold. It races hot. It races under stress. It races while materials expand, while tiny gaps move, while the engine becomes something slightly different from the machine that was sitting quietly in the garage. And that was the suspected gap. Rivals believed Mercedes had found a way for the engine to pass the cold check, but behaved differently once it reached full operating temperature. Cold, inside the limit. Hot, allegedly closer to a higher compression effect. That is why teams were furious. Because if that interpretation was working, Mercedes were not just beating rivals with a better engine. They were beating them with the difference between how the rule was written and how the rule was measured. That is the kind of thing Formula One teams cannot ignore. A visible part can be copied. A wing shape can be studied. A floor edge can be photographed. But a thermal behavior inside an engine is harder to see, harder to prove, and harder to fight. And the reported gain was enormous. Up to 0.3 of a second per lap. 0.3 can change an entire season. It can decide qualifying. It can protect tires. It can give the driver margin. It can make a car look stable because the driver does not have to overforce every corner to stay competitive. Now compare that with Monaco. Antonelli took pole by 43 thousandths. That is why the rival reaction was so intense. Because a controversy involving tenths had collided with a pole decided by thousandths. But then came the twist that made the story even more uncomfortable. By Monaco, the FIA had already changed the enforcement. The engine would no longer be judged only when cold. It would also be assessed at a representative operating temperature of 130 degrees Celsius. In plain English, Formula One stopped asking only what the engine looked like while resting. It started asking what the engine became while working. That was supposed to close the loophole. That was supposed to show whether Mercedes' advantage had depended on a clever thermal interpretation. That was supposed to let the field breathe again. Instead, Antonelli took pole. And that changed the revolt completely. Because now rivals had a harder question. If the hot engine trick was closed, why were Mercedes still at the front? That question is more dangerous than the original accusation. Because one loophole can be banned. One test can be changed. One exploit can be removed. But if the car remains fast after the obvious loophole is closed, then the advantage may be somewhere else. Or worse, everywhere else. That is the possibility that terrifies rival teams. Maybe Mercedes were not dominating because of one trick. Maybe the trick was only the most visible part of a much larger system. Maybe the W17 was fast because the engine, the hybrid deployment, the aerodynamics, the braking platform, the tires, and the driver confidence all worked together better than anything else on the grid. That kind of advantage is much harder to attack. You cannot protest an entire philosophy in one document. You cannot ban a team's understanding overnight. You cannot copy a connected system just because you have finally spotted one piece of it. And that is why Monaco did not calm the paddock. It made the paddock more suspicious. Because the FIA had taken away the simple explanation, and Mercedes were still too strong to ignore. This is where the front wing question begins to matter. Earlier in the season, footage from the Chinese Grand Prix raised concerns about the Mercedes front wing flaps. Rivals noticed that under braking, the flaps appeared to remain in an intermediate position, not fully behaving as expected within the required closing window. To most people, that sounds tiny. A flap moving slightly differently. A small delay. A piece of carbon fiber doing something strange. But Formula One is built from tiny things becoming enormous. The front wing is the first part of the car that touches the air. It shapes everything behind it. The floor. The tires. The rear wing. The stability of the car when the driver turns in. Think of it like the first person walking into a crowded hallway. If that person shifts slightly, everyone behind them has to adjust. The whole flow changes because of one movement at the front. That is what the front wing does to airflow. And under braking, that can matter massively. Braking is not just slowing down. It is the moment when the car is at its most loaded, most unstable, and most demanding. The front tires are being crushed into the track. The rear of the car is becoming lighter. The driver is asking the machine to stop, rotate, grip, and prepare for acceleration, all at once. A stable car gives confidence. Confidence gives commitment. Commitment gives lap time. And Monaco is built entirely on commitment. A driver who hesitates loses time. A driver who leaves margin loses time. A driver who does not fully trust the front of the car cannot attack the walls with the same violence. Antonelli looked like he trusted the Mercedes. That is why the wing issue mattered even after the FIA cleared it. The FIA investigation found no deliberate software manipulation. The explanation was insufficient hydraulic pressure, a design miscalculation that affected how the wing closed under certain air loads. No penalty was issued. But a clearance does not always end suspicion in Formula One. Sometimes it changes the shape of it. Because rivals still saw a system unusual enough to be investigated. And when that sits beside an engine loophole, it starts to feel like part of the same pattern. The engine question was about temperature. The front wing question was about movement under load. Both pointed to one deeper theme. What does the Mercedes become when the car is alive? Not when it is sitting in the garage. Not when it is being checked in a calm condition. But when it is hot, fast, loaded, vibrating, braking, turning, and being pushed by Antonelli through Monaco's walls. That is where rival teams believe performance can hide. And that is why the revolt had force. Because teams were not only asking whether the Mercedes passed the current checks. They were asking whether the current checks were enough. That is a much bigger accusation. Then came the hybrid shutdown controversy, and this one made the situation even more serious because it involved safety. Under the new rules, cars had to reduce electrical energy deployment as they approached the timing line on a qualifying lap. In simple terms, the electric boost had to fade down. Teams were not supposed to keep using maximum deployment all the way to the end without restriction. But Mercedes and Red Bull reportedly found a way around that by using an emergency shutdown function connected to the hybrid system. That function existed for real faults. For protection. For moments when the car needed to shut part of itself down before damage became worse. But according to the controversy, it could be used intentionally near the end of a qualifying lap, allowing the car to avoid the normal power reduction for longer. An emergency function became a performance shortcut. And that is where the sport starts to become uncomfortable. Because Formula One rewards cleverness, but it cannot allow safety systems to become planned weapons for lap time. At the Japanese Grand Prix, the risk became visible. Antonelli and Verstappen both suffered sudden power losses through corners, leaving them slow in high-speed sections while other cars were arriving quickly. Alexander Albon was also affected by complications connected to the same system. That changed the tone. A slow car in a fast section is dangerous. The closing speed can be huge. The driver behind may not expect it. The driver with the issue has almost no defense. Ferrari raised safety concerns. The FIA issued a technical directive. Emergency shutdowns had to be used only for genuine emergencies, not as a systematic performance tool. And Antonelli himself acknowledged that the trick was not safe, supporting the ban from a driver's safety point of view. That matters because drivers do not casually give up performance. If something makes them faster, they usually want it. So when a driver admits a method is unsafe, the issue has moved beyond politics. It has reached the cockpit. Now connect the full picture. A hot engine loophole. A front wing investigation. A hybrid trick restricted after safety concerns. And then Antonelli still taking Monaco pole after the clampdowns had already begun. That is why teams revolted. Not because the source says Antonelli's Monaco lap was thrown out. It was not. Not because the source says Mercedes received a major Monaco penalty. It does not. The only official Mercedes penalty mentioned from that weekend was a minor fine after George Russell exceeded the pit lane speed limit in practice by a tiny margin. The revolt comes from something deeper. Rivals felt the FIA had confirmed the gray areas mattered, but had not fully explained why Mercedes were still so fast. And when a championship-leading team remains fast after multiple technical controversies, every rival has a reason to push harder. Ferrari had reason to push. Red Bull had reason to push. Honda, Audi, McLaren, every team fighting under the new regulations had reason to ask whether the playing field had been level from the start. Because the championship points were already real. Antonelli was leading. Russell was second. Mercedes were ahead in the Constructors' Championship. These were not theoretical advantages. They were shaping the season. And in Formula One, timing can be everything. If a gray area gives a team performance early, and the FIA closes it later, the points do not disappear automatically. The momentum does not reset. The confidence does not vanish. The development direction does not suddenly equalize. That is why rival teams become angry. They are not only fighting what Mercedes might do next. They are fighting what Mercedes may have already gained. That is the emotional core of the revolt. A feeling that the new era may have been shaped before everyone understood the rules properly. And Mercedes, whether by genius, aggression, or interpretation, may have been the first team to exploit that uncertainty. This is what makes Formula One so ruthless. The rulebook is not just a set of limits. It is a battlefield. Teams read every line, every missing phrase, every measurement condition, every timing window, every exception, every emergency function, every definition of temperature, load, and movement.